Okay, shall we begin the session?
Yes, sir. We have a quorum. Others will join.
Right. Okay. So, good afternoon to everyone in India, and good morning to everyone in Brussels. We are now for the gathering together for the second day of the India-Europe engagement on the global economy. We have already had yesterday two very interesting and stimulating sessions. One looking at the geopolitical landscape and where do India and the EU try to locate themselves. We also had a very interesting discussion on trade issues, investment issues, particularly with respect to the commitment of the two sides to multilateralism. What are the kind of convergences that there may be between the two countries taking this relationship forward. And today we are going to be looking at two, again, very important subjects. This session, which I will be chairing, is on engagement between the two sides on climate change, which is becoming a very major item on the global agenda, and rightly so. So we have as my co-chair Andre Seppi, who's a senior fellow at Bruegel. He will be making the closing remarks at this session. But we have two very distinguished panelists to take us through this subject in terms of how each side looks at this challenge of climate change, and are there ways in which the two sides can work together. And given the fact that also both sides are very committed to multilateralism, is there some way in which the two sides can really see ways in which we can really work together on this particular challenge? So the two panelists that we have Mr. Simone Taglia Pietra, who's a research fellow at Bruegel. Simone is an Italian citizen. He's, as I said, a research fellow at Bruegel. He's an adjunct professor of global energy fundamentals at the Johns Hopkins University. And he is also senior researcher at the Fondazione Enrico Mattei. I hope I've got the pronunciation right. He's also a lecturer at the Università Cattolica di Sacro Cuore, senior associate research fellow at the Istituto per gli Studi di Politica International, and Ron resident fellow at the Payne Institute of the Colorado School of Mines. He recently authored the books Energy in Africa, then the European gas markets, energy relations in the Mediterranean, the geoeconomics of sovereign wealth funds and renewable energy. And before joining Bruegel in 2015, he also worked at the Istanbul Policy Center of Sabancı University and at the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. He is a member of the editorial board of the European Energy Journal and a senior expert member of the Euromed Economists Association. So a very distinguished record. As you can see, he has very much kept his focus on energy-related issues. And of course, climate change and energy are really two sides of the same coin in a sense, because really the challenge is how do we make that strategic shift from our current reliance on fossil fuels to a pattern of economic activity which is based much more on clean energy, based much more on renewable energy, because really meeting the challenge of climate change in a very fundamental sense involves making that shift. I will introduce Navroz just before he is called upon to speak. So may I request Simone to please set the ball rolling with his presentation. Simone, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this presentation. Thank you very much to all of you to be here today. to discuss what is indeed a very important topic. As it was said, climate change is now at the top of the agenda in Europe, but also it is an important topic also in the Indian policy agenda, together with the issue of energy. And therefore, it is absolutely worthwhile to look into how Europe and India could eventually further cooperate in this space. Well, if you allow me, I would then share my presentations. I prepare a couple of slides to really try to introduce you to what is the European perspective and current action on climate, to then see what could be the potential for cooperation with India. Let me start by saying that in Europe there is a very strong support in society for stronger climate action. Over the last years, this support has become overwhelming. According to the Eurobarometer data, 90% of Europeans see climate change as a serious problem, and they want to see the institutions acting strongly on this front. There are many reasons behind such a high level of social support for climate change mitigation policies. Not the least, I have to say that the increased number of extreme weather events that also Europe is assisting to over the last years has really allowed people to understand that climate change is not a faraway problem, but is something that touches the life of everyone. So on the basis of these social, let's say, quest for more climate action, we had last year in the European elections, so the elections for the European Parliament, a very strong win of green parties across Europe. Green parties across Europe have augmented their political weight, and this has stimulated also the bigger political families, the Social Democrats and the Popular, the European People's Party, to become more ambitious on climate change mitigation. This is the overall social and political dynamics that has ignited the idea of the European Green Deal. It is on this context that the new president of the European Commission, so the European Union executive branch, last year when she came into office, she made this idea of European Green Deal as a central pillar of the action of her commission. So here you see the agenda that President Ursula von der Leyen presented last year in front of the European Parliament. And as you can see, the European Green Deal is the item number 1. So this is what we have really seen last year. Now, what is this Green Deal all about? The European Green Deal, which now represents the policy framework of reference for Europe in the climate space, represents a wide-ranging policy framework that tries to encompass more than 50 different policy areas to make sure that the European Union embarks into a trajectory that will ultimately lead to climate neutrality by 2050. As you know, the target of climate neutrality by the middle of the century has been basically set by climate science, which has clarified that in order to avoid the most dramatic impacts of climate change, the world has to maintain the global temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius, and most notably, hopefully, 1.5 degrees Celsius. And since the Industrial Revolution, the global temperature has already increased by 1 degree. So there is an urgent need to scale up the climate effort. And to get there, it is important to reach climate neutrality by 2050. To do that, the European Green Deal intends to mobilize green finance, intends to scale up the European support for renewable energy and energy efficiency, which has already been progressively scaled up over the last 20 years in Europe, also bringing some positive and interesting developments for renewables and energy efficiency in the continent, but overall at the global level, due to the market that Europe created for renewable energy technologies. But I would say that the interesting side of the European Green Deal is the fact that, as we will see later on, it brings climate policy beyond the traditional realm of climate and energy policies as such. So as you can see in this graph, the European Green Deal also encompasses policies targeting sustainable transport. So for example, the promotion of electric mobility and other sustainable means of transportation. It has a very strong pillar on biodiversity preservation. So you can well see, consider the European Green Deal to have two pillars. One is climate change mitigation and the other one is environmental protection. And there, biodiversity preservation plays a very important role. There is then a focus on circular economy. So the idea of limiting the resources that the economy requires to develop and to basically provide a constant level of outcome. There is then a focus on the common agriculture policy, so how to make agriculture more sustainable. And finally, a very important issue, which is the one of just transition. There is a clear recognition that the transition towards climate neutrality will have huge impacts on the economy. There is a recognition that certain segments of the economy will be left, risks to be left behind. And you can think about coal mines, you can think about carbon intensive industries that will have to be phased out, etc. So the idea is we cannot leave these people behind. We need to take this situation in our hands and try to ensure that through social policies, the transition is as just as possible. So this is in a nutshell what the European Green Deal is all about. And if you allow me to try to create a synthesis of all this, you can consider the European Green Deal mission to be the one of intelligently promoting deep decarbonization, so the target of climate neutrality by 2050, accompanying the economic and industrial transformation that this transformation will necessarily imply, because energy touches all the sectors of the economy, of course, and ensuring the social inclusiveness of the overall process. So if you unpack the name of the initiative itself, you can see, first of all, that European is not only EU level, so it's not, let's say, only, federal level, but it is a choral effort that the EU institutions have to do together with member states and with the regional authorities as well. Green is not only climate, as I said, is climate neutrality, but is also environmental and biodiversity preservation. And then the deal. The deal component clearly recalls Franklin Delano Roosevelt, New Deal. And this is the socioeconomic part of the initiative, where the key pillars really are the promotion of green investments, the promotion of just transition, and therefore social policies, and the promotion of a green industrial policy aimed at turning this energy transition into an industrial opportunity. And here the example is to shift for example, energy sector from oil and gas and fossil fuels to renewables, to shift the automotive industry from the internal combustion engine cars to electric cars, and so on and so forth. The underlying philosophy, if you wish, of the European Green Deal is the one of pushing climate action beyond climate policy. And I think it is fair to recognize that this is something that Europe learned also out of negative experiences, such as the one we have experienced over the last years in France with the Gilets jaunes, when the French government tried to introduce a carbon tax in the transportation sector, which would have immediately raised the cost of the gasoline at the pump. All of a sudden, people reacted, and some of the people in France started to say, look, this is going to be unjust, because this climate policy, raising ultimately the price of the gasoline, will impact the poor more than the rich. So the distributional effects of climate policy were brought into the discussion, and it was clarified that only tackling these issues, the decarbonization process can be socially sustainable over time. And therefore, there was a reaction by the French government, but also by the European institutions overall, to design a broader climate policy, also trying to take into consideration these aspects that are really economic, fiscal, of industrial policy nature, of labor policies, and of course research and innovation, which plays a very important role in all these aspects. This is a domestic situation. Of course, what will happen in Europe with the European Green Deal could have global implications as well. If you think about the energy market, for example, the European Union represents almost 25% of the globally traded oil. It is clear that if Europe manages to significantly reduce the consumption of oil in the continent after 2030, we could expect a fall in oil prices globally. So this is just an example of how, due to its size, what happens in Europe with the European Green Deal could have certainly global implications that therefore will also interest India. There is another important global dimension of the European Green Deal, which relates to the fact that Europe only produces around 9% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It is clear in Europe that a European Green Deal only looking at greening the European economy would not represent a sufficient contribution to tackle climate change, given the current level of contribution of Europe to greenhouse gases. And therefore, there is a clear recognition that the European Green Deal needs to be promoted globally. And that's where I think we start to see potential complementarities between Europe and India in this space. Over the next years, Europe will likely scale up its global action to foster clean energy solutions. There are different tools that the EU can utilize to do so. First of all, the European budget and also the European post-COVID-19 recovery fund, Next Generation EU. The European Union has decided that as of 2021, 30% of all spending of the European Union, so the budget of the institution itself and also the recovery fund, must be devoted to green actions. This entails that between 2021 and 2027, 600 billion euros will be made available by the EU for the green transition. We at Bruegel have had also the internal discussions also for research papers that are forthcoming on the geopolitics of the European Green Deal, and we think there is a case to devote 10% at least of these resources to export the European Green Deal globally, for example, by promoting renewable energy investments abroad, in order to accompany the decarbonization process of different countries, but also by doing so, promoting, for example, European renewable energy companies that are willing to find new cooperation potentials globally. Another important tool here is the EU development policy. As you know, the European Union is one of the largest, if not the largest, donor in terms of official development assistance. And this is a tool that can be utilized to promote renewable energy, notably for the electrification of rural areas in developing countries. And here the main target will most notably be the African continent. But this is something that could be utilized also in other parts of the world. All these could have a triple dividend for Europe. It's good for climate policy, it's good for industrial policy because it also promotes European green companies abroad, and it is also good for foreign policy because it allows Europe to strengthen relations with foreign partners. Another important issue that is very high on the European agenda is the one of carbon border adjustment. The EU seeks to introduce carbon border adjustment measures in order to avoid the risks of carbon leakage. So the idea is if Europe becomes more and more committed to climate change mitigation, and for example, if the carbon price in Europe goes up, we should also make sure that the European industry is not put in a difficult position vis-a-vis competition from outside competitors from countries that are not ambitious in climate action. To prevent this, but also to promote the decarbonization of other countries that are not acting sufficiently, the EU intends to introduce carbon border adjustment measures. As my colleague André Sapir and other colleagues have suggested, this would be better done in a multilateral manner. So rather than imposing this measure unilaterally, and therefore here there is scope to cooperate with other players, other countries in the definition of these measures, also in the framework of the WTO, of course. I wanted to provide you some figures to see if India could be impacted by the introduction of this measure, and frankly, this doesn't seems to be the case. If you look at the most carbon-intensive goods that Europe imports and are the goods that are likely to be subjected to these carbon border adjustment measures first, because these will not apply to all imports at the beginning, you see that countries that will likely be most affected are Turkey, Russia, Algeria, China, and Norway, but India is not exposed to Europe with this regard, and therefore I do not expect India to feel the impacts of an eventual carbon border adjustment measures imposed by Europe as other countries that you can see in this chart. To conclude, the EU and India have tried for years to set up a climate cooperation framework. We had in July a virtual EU-India summit, the 15th edition of the EU-India summit, and there was a general agreement on the need to further strengthen the climate cooperation between the two blocs. There are initiatives ongoing, such as the Clean Energy and Climate Partnership, the International Solar Alliance, wanted by France and India. There is the International Platform on Sustainable Finance. There are other areas that, according to the declaration, should be pursued, such as biodiversity cooperation, sustainable cities, circular economy, etc. Now, these are all significant initiatives, but if you look at the numbers, it seems that the cooperation, notably on renewable energy, is still not so much developed between the two blocs. I looked, for example, at the numbers about the European Investment Bank commitment to India. The European Investment Bank is committed in India since 1993. So far, it has only invested 658 million euros for climate action. it is clear, in my view, that also in the framework of the European Green Deal, a much stronger action might be pursued as the European Investment Bank seeks to become the EU climate bank, as India really represents an important potential partner for Europe in this space. Beyond climate finance, there are also other areas that could be underlined as potential cooperation: renewable technology cooperation, energy efficiency standards and best practices, environmental regulation best practices. What Europe can offer, I think, is also an experience in regulating these issues, and frankly speaking, also based on a number of failures that we can share, so that these failures are not replicated by others in the future. And there is really the case for mutual benefit from having such an exchange, which honestly, I think tends to remain very high-level political today, and could really become far more operational and therefore impactful as we move forward in this field. So this would be my initial contribution, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Simone, for that very comprehensive presentation, and particularly with respect to the European Union's own commitment to this Green Deal, and to see whether there are any areas where India and the EU can really forge a stronger partnership. It certainly seems that there are lots of opportunities in terms of investment, particularly in renewable energy or energy efficiency projects. But I think also we need to see whether in the new phase that is coming now with the Paris Agreement coming into force, are there ways in which Europe and India can work together in the multilateral context, because I think there is, and I think quite in a timely manner, there is a renewed focus on climate change as a major global challenge. We have a change in administration in the United States, and with a new president seemingly very much committed to putting climate change on top of the US agenda, appointment of John Kerry as a special envoy for climate change. And this is something that India welcomes because we certainly believe that this is going to be a defining challenge for us during the coming decades. But there are also, I must admit, there are also some anxieties. So the border adjustment mechanism that you mentioned does cause concern as to how this is going to be impacted. And as you said, we must avoid the impression that this could become a kind of a trade limiting measure. And the second aspect also is that in terms of taking the multilateral process forward, while it is true that John Kerry has actually been elevated to being a part of the National Security Council, there has been a projection that climate change is not just a climate change issue, but it's also a national security issue. And if it is a national security issue, then there are some other considerations which also come in, and that could change the nature of the manner in which we deal with the issue of climate change. So those do raise some anxieties. And I think that in terms of the engagement going forward, while we are looking at opportunities where India and the EU can really work together on clean energy, on renewable energy efficiency, for example, and I'm very happy that you have actually put it in the context of the broader ecological challenge. That is climate change, not just as climate change, but climate change as part and parcel of a larger ecological challenge. So biodiversity, for example, environmental pollution, for example, they all sort of tie in with the challenge of climate change. So it is really worthwhile looking at this in that larger context. And that is also something that we find here in India, we are beginning to realize that we can't just focus on climate change as climate change. It is so much linked up together with issues of environmental pollution. It is linked with the issue of biodiversity loss. So we have to look at this in a much more comprehensive manner. So thank you very much for that presentation, and I hope that as we go forward, the international and the multilateral aspect also is something that that we can address. So thank you. We now have, of course, Navroz from the CPR to make his presentation. Let me just also mention here that we have, I'm chairing this particular session, but I'm a co-chair, and my very distinguished co-chair is Andre Sapir, who's a senior fellow from Bruegel and someone who has been associated with the European Commission for a long period of time and has been addressing many of these, global issues over this extended career that he has had. So, Andre, also welcome to you as a co-chair. Andre will be making the closing remarks at the end of this session. Also, I would like to just mention that the Q&A box is open. So you can please pose your questions there, which I will try and take after the presentations have been done. If you'd like to ask the question orally, then you can raise your hand and I will call upon you to ask your question. And you can indicate who you wish to answer that question. Now, let us now move to the second presentation for this afternoon. So I have great pleasure in introducing Dr. Navroz Dubash. Navroz is professor at CPR, and he's also coordinator of the initiative on climate, energy, and environment in CPR. Navroz, by the way, is also currently a coordinating lead author for national policies and institutions chapter of the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And he has also been a lead author and synthesis report author for the IPCC's 5th assessment report. He has served on India's expert committee on low carbon strategies for inclusive growth and other national committees on water and energy policy. Navroz is an associate editor of Climate Policy. He serves on the editorial boards of Global Environmental Politics, Energy Research in Social Science, Environmental Policy and Governance, and the Journal of Environment and Development. Navroz in 2015 was conferred the 12th TN Khushbu Memorial Award in recognition of the impact of his work on Indian climate change policy and the international discourse on global climate governance. He has also been, an author of several books. Recently published book is India in the Warming World, Integrating Climate Change and Development. Other edited books include Mapping Power, The Political Economy of Electricity in India's States, a Handbook of Climate Change and India, Development Policy and Governance, and The Rise of the Regulatory State of the South. His book, Tubewell Capitalism, was awarded the SR Sen Prize in 2006 for the best book in agricultural economics and rural development in India. Dr. Dubash has earlier served as an associate professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University and IDFC chair professor of governance and public policy at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy in Delhi. And he holds a MA and PhD in energy and resources from the University of California, Berkeley, and an AB in public and international affairs from Princeton University. So again, a very distinguished record and someone who has earned a name for himself as one of India's foremost climate change experts. So Navroz, you have the floor. And 15 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Saran, and thank you for that generous introduction. Very pleased to be part of this conversation with our colleagues from Europe, Andre Sapir and Dr. Simoni. I will try and be quite brief so we can get to the conversation. I'm going to start by picking up Ambassador Saran's invitation to complement the conversation at the national level by thinking about the changed multilateral context. So we've had, I think, several years here of somewhat suffocating international environment, shall we say, for climate cooperation. We've seen sliding in the US, obviously, in Australia, in Brazil, other notable countries. There's really been a question of who is going to, in a sense, pick up the ball and carry it down the field, which is a very inappropriate American metaphor for this context, but nonetheless. I think we are now at a point where the European Union has been consistently pushing for cooperative multilateral action on climate change. And India is in a very interesting place because we have actually become part of, in a sense, at least through our conversations and our articulation globally, we are very much keen on being part of the solution. But that part of the solution has to take cognizance of India's development challenges and so on. So India, in a sense, has aspects of our position that link back to the past. India is, at the end of the day, a country where development priorities are extremely large and politically much more prominent by contrast with what we just heard about the European Union. But at the same time, there's much greater recognition that climate change is a serious issue for India. And of course, we have a potentially open environment in China. So how can the EU and India work together along with other sort of countries as a coalition to take this forward? I'm going to sort of address that, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but I think the first point on that, to make sure that India and the EU are working together on this, is for us to have a conceptual understanding that is shared about what progress on climate change looks like in our respective regions, and what key terms like ambition actually mean. Right? So I just want to come back to that in a minute. That's where I'll sort of pick up this conversation, but I want to flag this. What do we mean by ambition? Before I go there, I just want to sort of reflect what Dr. Tagliapietra said and talk about what India has been doing, not in as much detail, because I think the story is reasonably well known and the EU has new developments. But in India, our approach has really been an approach that rests on looking for opportunities to reach development outcomes while simultaneously shifting to a low carbon future. It's a co-benefits based approach. It's opportunistic in nature. And we have found big opportunities, in particular around renewable energy, in particular around energy efficiency, to some extent in areas like urbanization, and all of this wrapped up in a carbon intensity target, which is articulated in our NDC. So our approach has been opportunistic. It has not so far been strategic in the way in which the European Union is trying to pivot to a more strategic all of economy kind of redirection. But I think that India is actually ripe for that kind of pivot as well. So coming back to I have three broad sets of points that I want to cover. The first is about this question of, are we on the same page in understanding the nature of the challenge and the opportunity, which I think is important if we're going to be multilaterally pushing in the same direction towards both more ambitious as well as a better implemented Paris Agreement. And I want to flag one area where I think we need a little bit more conversation. When we hear the Europeans talk about climate ambition, what we're hearing increasingly is the articulation of, a few years ago, it was about a peaking year being articulated relatively soon. And the discourse has shifted now to talking about net zero targets, right? So ambition is, a good marker of ambition is a net zero target. And along with that, an indication of what the benchmark is in the interim. So the European Union's 2030 target of 55%. The UK has now come up with a 68% target, which is quite impressive. So the net zero story, as well as some sort of interim, that is in shorthand what globally is being constructed as ambition. And of course, China has recently come out with a net zero target of its own, I think by 2060. And the debate in India is, would it be useful for India to come up with a net zero target? And is the global expectation that India would come up with a net zero target? So I want to be a little iconoclastic here and suggest that a unitary focus on ambition equals net zero is probably misplaced, both because it will be hard to sustain politically in India, but more important, I don't think it actually does the job of moving India rapidly in a low carbon direction. Let me try and explain what I mean. And where I'm going with this is to articulate the need for a broader understanding of what we mean by climate ambition. We need to have different ways of thinking about this. So what does India need to do really to shift to a low carbon future? I would suggest that the situation in a country where we have not locked into a lot of our emissions as yet, where we have a lot of development yet to achieve, is different from a country like the EU, where the impetus is to decrease as fast as possible. In India, the key question is, how do we avoid emissions, right? So the concept of avoided emissions should actually be the primary concept for India. How do we manage to get the greatest development with the least carbon and avoid emissions in doing so? How do we avoid doing what China did between 2005 and 2015, which is this steep increase in emissions at the same time as they had steep increases in GDP per capita, right? We need the latter without the former. Avoided emissions, I would suggest, means thinking about how we are building our economy. What are our cities going to look like? How are we going to provide jobs for the millions of people who are entering the workforce? How are we going to construct our buildings in a way that don't lock us into a high carbon future? So there are a set of structural changes we have to bring about. And those structural changes have to start now, because we have to really front load action to avoid this lock-in. So avoiding lock-in has to be the key phrase. Now, net zero, a net zero target 30, 40 years into the future, if we take a page out of, say, China's book, doesn't actually help us envision how you avoid emissions now. So I would suggest that we need a more elastic concept of what ambition is. To say that for some countries, it's going to be sort of about a net zero target, it's going to be about rapid absolute reductions. For other countries, what we really need to see is sector by sector transitions, where you're locking in a low carbon future and locking out a high carbon future. And those sector by sector conversations are politically much more likely to carry water in India. What is the transition we're looking for in our electricity sector? What are we going to do with our transport corridors? What are we going to do with urbanization patterns? Those are conversations that we can have, and they are politically more tractable, because you will not get the same kind of opinion poll results in India that you will in Europe, with 93% saying climate change is the #1 issue. Climate change is very important, but it will be articulated and understood in terms of its impacts. So it will be the effect of climate on agriculture, but it'll show up in opinion polls in terms of concerns about agriculture, or in terms of concerns about cities flooding, right? Or in terms of concerns about storm damage. So there is a sort of a once remove. So in India, politically, as well as in terms of our articulation globally, we need to think about a more flexible way of talking about ambition. So this is sort of the main kind of conceptual point I want to make. And I will also say that there are also differences in the governance styles. So the European Union works well when you have this EU directive, which is then followed by national implementing policies or national laws and so on and so forth. Just to make it to underscore the point, India's carbon intensity targets have not actually driven much change in India. What has driven change are domestic targets that preceded the intensity target. So in India, our change is not driven necessarily by what we project to the international community. What we project to the international community is layered on top of quite ambitious domestic targets, right? So forcing a net zero conversation when it runs against Indian domestic politics, I think will be counterproductive in some ways. So I want to put that out there. There are different ways of defining leadership around climate change. And if India and the EU are to get together and be joint leaders, we have to have a more elastic concept of what ambition means that encompasses some of the ideas I've just put forward. Let me then turn to a few more specifics. There are a couple of hot button issues, which Ambassador Saran also mentioned, and probably the border carbon adjustment debate is a big one. And I look forward to actually finding the paper that you mentioned that Dr. Sapir has written on, suggesting that a multilateral approach to border carbon adjustments might be a good way to go. And I apologize, I haven't seen that yet. I look forward to reading it. Two observations here. My understanding of the economics literature is that so far, the European Union measures, including the carbon price, have actually not resulted in very much leakage. So the argument that a border carbon adjustment is required because of leakage, I'm not sure that the empirical evidence or the modeling evidence really exists to back that up. I suspect that part of the argument is really a domestic political argument about domestic industries and the need to feel that they're not exposed to unfair competition. So I think we should be careful to unpack these two things, right? If it is actually an argument about domestic industries and it's not an argument about leakage, then we need to design the mechanism in such a way that separates those objectives out. It is possible, of course, that as the carbon price goes up, the risks of leakage will increase. But I think we have to be very careful about the grounds on which we are talking about this. And I would agree that a multilateral conversation is important. And here, probably bringing the Americans in is also necessary, as this is also part of, I think, President-elect Biden's platform. Related to this, I wonder whether an important confidence building measure could be much more efforts at clear and consistent disclosure standards across different industries in different countries. If we understand what is being done in different countries, we are in a much better position to understand whether countries are operating, industries in different countries are operating under a similar regulatory environment, both formal regulatory environment, as well as the kinds of voluntary measures that are being taken. So de facto, are there such differences in industries across countries? To get to that point, we'll need to have more transparency and consistent disclosure standards. So a confidence building measure around the border carbon adjustment could be this idea of thinking much more carefully about disclosure standards. As others have mentioned, we have this India-EU Clean Energy and Climate Partnership. There's lots of things that are underway there. I'm just going to briefly mention, of course, continuing conversations about the ISA and the Climate Disaster Resistant Infrastructure Initiative and so on are very useful. They are high-profile initiatives for India, and the support of the EU would be very important. But I think three areas I particularly want to mention where we could work together, and I'll just take 2 minutes for this, Ambassador Saran, and then stop. The first is that one of the interesting things about the climate conversation is that every country has been building these kinds of visions of the future, but we've all done a pretty poor job of building the internal government machinery to figure out how to get there. Perhaps the European Union is a little further ahead. I actually find the UK approach of a climate change committee that does analysis and recommends things to Parliament and so on is quite an interesting approach. We have just created a body, in a formal body in India. We've had others in the past, but it is more at the level of coordination across ministries. We need to really build up the ability to model, figure out what the synergies and trade-offs are across development objectives, figuring out monitoring structures. How do we actually put in place the back-end institutional machinery for a Paris-like ratchet mechanism? Many countries around the world actually don't have that back-end machinery. And I think that's something that we could actually fruitfully work on together, learning how the EU has done it and talking about how that would work in our governance structure. The second area for joint work is putting in place the kinds of sectoral transitions I talked about. So I personally would much rather see Indian cities develop in the direction of European cities, for example, than American cities with sort of more dense forms, more public transport based and so on and so forth. So thinking about urbanization and public transport systems in a systematic way, and of course, you know, these are handled at the subsidiary federal level in India. but there are nonetheless sort of complementarities, and one could structure a conversation around that. Similarly, with climate resilient cities, perhaps thinking about India's cooling initiative. So there are big sectoral bites that one could actually devise joint work around that I think would be really important. And the final suggestion I will make is taking this language of a just transition. India has to, like many other countries, also think about its coal belt. Where are employment prospects going to come from for people who are employed in the coal industry, as well as their families and communities dependent on them? That is a transition conversation that obviously is occurring in Germany, perhaps starting in Poland. We could have a joint conversation around that. It is something India has to think about. It's not going to happen imminently, but then again, it is the kind of transition that takes 10 to 15 years. So we need to start having that conversation now. And that's, again, an area for fruitful discussion. So let me just pause there and hand it back to Ambassador Sarun. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Navroz, and I must particularly thank you for giving us an Indian perspective in terms of what the climate change challenge means at the Indian end. Our challenges are very different from what, for example, Europe or the United States may be facing. Also very different from what China is facing. I think I mentioned yesterday that there is a tendency outside India, especially in terms of international negotiations, to put India and China on the same in the same sort of bracket, and that leads to a lot of difficulty in terms of how does India hope to play some kind of a constructive role, because it is constantly being benchmarked with China with regard to many of the issues. You mentioned the coal issue. Just to also point out something that you yourself have drawn attention to, that if you really look at the coal story in India, I mean, the sort of ambition to have 100,000 megawatt of additional coal-based thermal power, now it seems nothing like that is going to happen. I mean, in fact, it is in a sense it has plateaued, and several of the older coal-based thermal power plants are actually being closed down, are being retired. I think even if we are not talking about, say, a carbon market, the fact that India has for some time now in the Indian context, a fairly large cess on coal, which if I'm not mistaken is about 400 rupees per ton, which is quite large. So in a sense, there is a sort of disincentive in terms of using coal as a source of power. So I think one should also look at the ground situation in terms of when I find a great deal of this observations in the international discourse that India is going to be a big problem going forward because of its dependence upon coal, where actually I see that there is not much going in that coal story. So perhaps some nuancing is necessary, and that kind of nuancing can only come if we are going to have a much more sort of a deeper engagement with our partners both in Europe as well as the United States of America. Because I think going forward, my sense is that since everybody is looking for what is that one big thing that we can do on climate change, the coal story is going to be probably at the center of this international narrative, and how we handle that as India is going to be very important. So I think that's something that we should look at. What I will do before getting on to the question and answer session is to now ask Simone, having heard what Navroz has had to say, in the next maybe 3-4 minutes, would you like to respond and see whether there is some additional comments that you would like to make? And I will do the same with Navroz just after you have spoken. Simone, you have the floor.
Thank you. I have to say that I completely agree with the framework of understanding that Navroz built. We should be very clear while sitting at the EU-India climate table that priorities are by necessity completely different, in the sense that it is clear that while India prioritizes development targets, the EU might have a different perspective, and therefore putting climate first due to a number of different reasons that are domestic, and therefore this is, in my view, a necessary starting point to understand each other's position. And I think, honestly, that this is also fair due to the common, to the principle of common but shared and differentiated responsibilities that link to the historical responsibility of Europe also in having created the problem of the build-up in emissions. I largely agree with the need to find this co-benefit approach. And I really think that the key to also sell this action domestically is the one of showing to people, this also is the case in Europe, the local impacts. We need to clarify that whatever we do for climate change mitigation, at the end of the day, cleans up the air that our kids breathe every day. That is the way to make this transition socially acceptable. And this is something that people could see in their daily life, while talking about climate change might indeed not be perceived as an urgent issue for the individual life. Maybe I would like to react on the point of why Europe is focusing so much on this carbon border adjustment measure, because it is right that all empirical assessments so far have shown that due to the emission trading system and therefore to the European carbon pricing system for power generation and the industrial sector, there has not been any risk of or evidence of carbon leakage. But this is the situation so far. This is a situation where the price of carbon in Europe has been traditionally extremely low. Only now we start to see 25 or 30 euros per ton of CO2, but traditionally the price of carbon in Europe has been extremely low. And on top of this, we have to consider that within the emission trading scheme, we grant so many free allowances to the polluters that they have even generated windfall benefits in the past. Clearly, we didn't see carbon leakage risks because they have benefited from the system that was there, the free allowances, to facilitate the setup and the politics behind it. But the risk will obviously emerge as the system will get serious, as the free allowances will be cut. And this will really be one of the key items in the reform of the carbon market in Europe next year, and as the price will go up. So the idea of putting in place a carbon border adjustment is really to make possible a reform of the carbon market and really make that tool useful, efficient, and sensible, which has honestly not been so far the case, due to this number of issues. So I would really expect Europe to, in 2021, to come up with proposal of carbon border adjustment, reach out to the US administration, because this multilateral dimension is of paramount importance. Europe was alone so far. Now this is not the case anymore. As you said, in its climate change and environmental justice program, Joe Biden has pledged to introduce carbon border adjustment measures in the US, not as a result of higher carbon pricing, because as we know that it's not going to work in the US, but as a result of stronger environmental regulations domestically. Europe and the United States will almost certainly in mid-2021, when we will see the EU-US summit discuss how to jointly introduce these measures. I have no doubts that that will go forward. I think there is now an opportunity in 2021 to set up a sort of global net zero coalition, that for sure. We see that countries are increasingly pledging such targets that, I agree, might not be useful domestically in a country like India to really create the narrative that is needed to do the right things as of tomorrow. But globally, it is important to set the destination in the climate GPS, let's say, in order to have a sense of direction. And I think that there is scope for international cooperation, notably on those that we can really consider to be the climate global goods. I think about, for example, international efforts for reforestation. I think about international efforts to deliver those negative emission technologies, from carbon capture and sequestration to geoengineering, direct air capture, etc., that according to all scenarios of the UN will be needed to get to 1.5 maximum raise in global temperature and therefore climate neutrality. So I think the world needs to think about what can we do in common. I would not expect, for example, Europe, the US, China, India, etc., to set up cooperation on issues like batteries or electric vehicles, etc., because their industrial policy priorities will remain and the competition between countries will likely remain. But there are technologies where the free riding problem is high because the cost is domestic but the benefit is global, like reforestation and negative emission technologies, in which international cooperation makes sense. So these are the items around which I think we can build up this sort of net zero coalition in 2021. We have Glasgow coming up. This is the right moment to do that.
Okay, thank you very much. Navroz, would you like to perhaps take up some of those points?
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm just looking at my notes here. So I think I took the opportunity of going second to address some of Simone's points in my first round of comments, and I think we're happy to move relatively quickly to bring in our colleagues. The one or two additional points I might just take a second to discuss are, I think that this idea that a global net zero target or a set of a net zero coalition setting the GPS, if you like, sending global signals, including to global business and so on and so forth, is something I agree with. I think that it is useful. I do think it's important that it be couched within the broader understanding I tried to lay out of what constitutes ambition, because otherwise you will arouse a defensive reaction in some countries, right? And I think what the Paris Agreement pivot tried to do, and the jury is still out as to how successful it has been, is to create the language of national self-determination and the language of opportunity. And we have to be very careful that in trying to using the metaphors of maps, compasses, and GPSs, we don't undermine that metaphor of national self-determination and language of opportunity. So that language is a language of inherent uncertainty. The language of GPS and maps and compasses is the language of certainty. And I think we've kind of recognized that climate change is not amenable, that the problem of climate change is less amenable to being treated like a mechanical system where you chart a course and then every country kind of follows. I mean, we need to perhaps have both sides of that, but I think we have to be cautious about flipping back in a sense to thinking about this as a mechanistic system. It's a political system where every country has to find a way of its own national politics developing in a way that support a low carbon transition. And those national narratives will be different country to country. So I think we have to keep that perspective in mind. The other sort of small piece that I would bring up here is he talked about the impact on the global oil markets, and Ambassador Saran talked about India's coal industry. And I think that we are going to see, and of course we have a big civil society coalition around a supply side approach to fossil fuels, the Keep It in the Ground campaign, the campaign that says let's have disclosure on the share prices of fossil fuel companies and so on and so forth. I think there is going to be sort of an interesting global politics around this, particularly around the oil providers, the coal exporters, and so on and so forth. And there's interesting discussion going on about, about why should the international multilateral cooperation only be on the demand side? Why can we not have multilateral cooperation on the supply side? I personally think it's probably a bridge too far. It'll be very hard to sustain that. But I do think that the understanding what the contours and the disruptions of economies for which fossil fuels have been a huge component, how that then gets unraveled and what that means for those economies. Thinking through that is really important if we're not going to end up creating blocking coalitions or deepening existing blocking coalitions. So I think it would behoove us to look at that supply side a little bit more carefully.
Okay, thank you very much. Andre, would you like to offer any comments before I move to the question and answer?
I thank you for the opportunity. I think I will wait until the end of the session.
Okay.
I will have I will have the floor. I think
sure.
At that time.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. So let's move on to the question and answers now. I see one hand raised. That is Suman Berry. Suman, would you like to come online and ask your question? Suman?
Very much, and to both of you. I'm on. Can I be heard?
We can hear you, but we can't see you.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. A bit distorted image, but why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, Suman, we are waiting for you.
I think Suman is having connectivity problems, so we can sort of.
Okay, so let me go to some of the other questions while he's getting his line again connected to us. So there is a question that has been asked by Nimi, which is to Simone. She says that China's pledge to carbon neutrality domestically by 2060 could well go hand in hand with a carbon intensive strategy internationally in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in Eastern Europe. That is, in terms of China's investments. What kind of distributional effects are these likely to entail? Simone, would you like to answer that question, please?
Thank you very much. I think this is a very sensible question because we have seen for the first time in September a commitment by the Chinese president for this carbon neutrality target in 2060. But the reality is that we still have no idea of how this will be implemented. We have no pathway. We lack a comprehensive policy framework on how to get there. So let's see whether next year China will come up in Glasgow with such a roadmap, notably for the next 10 years. But I have to say that what we are seeing so far is a contradiction between the pledge, carbon neutrality pledge, and, for example, the fact that only in the first half of 2020, China has authorized the building of coal-fired power plants domestically to a level that is much higher than the previous years altogether. And there is another contradiction which relates to the overseas investments of China that keeps being very much focused on coal. And this is both the case of the Belt and Road countries and Africa. And this is in a clear contradiction to the carbon neutrality pledge. So we need to understand how China will solve this contradiction for the time being.
Yeah. So that also, in fact, was the question which was asked by Anton, where he pointed out that, how does the EU benefit when China in Africa is successfully squeezing out Indian investments in the mining of minerals, essential for the low carbon future and the Green Deal. Case in point is how China forced Zambia to expropriate Indian investment recently. I was not aware that they had expropriated the Indian investments, but yeah, I mean that you have answered, Simone, in the sense that it is a cause for concern that whatever may be the target put forward by China in the multilateral context does not seem to be aligned with what China is doing both domestically, at least at this point of time, and what China seems to be doing externally in terms of, for example, the Belt and Road investments. Much of the power sector in Pakistan, for example, is all coal-based. So that is certainly a cause for concern. And Aditya Pillai from CBR has also asked a question to Simone, and which is to ask him whether he sees this whole issue of border carbon adjustments becoming more of an issue over the next decade or two, as India tries executing its own manufacturing and export ambitions. I mean, is there going to be a sort of a big focus on this, which may in fact cause some difficulty in terms of whatever prospects we are looking at for cooperation between the two sides? Do you think that given the kind of sort of a priority which is being attached to it both by Europe as well as by the United States, and maybe in the United States case it is very much targeted at China, but then we become collateral damage in some sense. So do you see this becoming a major issue as we go forward?
But according to the evidence we have so far on the role of India as an exporter of carbon-intensive goods to Europe, I don't see this being a risk, simply because current trade numbers tell us that India is not exposed in terms of the limited carbon-intensive goods that will be subjected to them for the time being. So my answer would be no. I also want to flag the issue that I would expect any carbon border adjustment measure in Europe to also have exceptions included for developing countries. So this is something that will need to be figured out by the ones that will design this issue, but this will be there because that is also part of the spirit of the Paris Agreement, and it is important not to disfavor developing countries in this context. So I would actually not see urgent, imminent risks for India from that measure, honestly.
Yeah. Okay. So let me turn to another question, and this is from Daphne, if I am not mistaken, from Turkey, who says most global climate negotiations are being done based on emission projections and with production per capita calculations. But though the production is being carried out in the global south, most of the consumption is being done in the north because of climate change. And it's been pointed out that a child, for example, in the US consumes 175 times more carbon than a kid in Bangladesh until the age of 6. So, is it possible for us to shift the global negotiations towards a framework which is based more on the consumption end rather than on the production end? Is that something which is possible? Navroz, would you like to take that?
Certainly, I'd be happy to venture a comment. Just if I might, one quick follow-up on the previous question. I think history tells us that India's negotiating positions are often not entirely guided by a narrow, immediate take on our own interests alone. They often are guided by our alliances and a larger set of principles. So, for example, we ended up negotiating quite closely with the basic countries, despite the fact that in terms of development indicators, we're actually quite far behind many of those countries because of a larger principle around emerging nations. And similarly, I think with border carbon adjustment, I don't think it's just going to be which of our sectors are exposed. It will also be a broader question of whether it is consistent with the CBDR principle as a guiding principle for the negotiations. So I would just sort of caution that I don't think we'll look at it purely from the point of view of the sort of immediate exposure, and I think the European Union should be aware of that. In terms of the consumption story, this is a fascinating story. All the numbers basically show that if you adjust what countries commit to when taking into account the embedded carbon that they import, then in fact what Europe and the UK and others have done over the last decade or two, which looks like it's significant moves towards low carbon, gets substantially undermined by the import of embedded carbon. So it is a very important part of the conversation. It is something that one should continue. I think that ultimately the framework that we have of international negotiations is not one of slicing up a pie really anymore, right? It is the sort of bottom-up targets. And so the question is not whether we should be thinking about the pie in terms of consumption, but whether we should be thinking about reporting what we do more clearly in terms of consumption metrics. So all of these sort of global non-governmental and research bodies, Global Climate Tracker and so on and so forth, as well as the global stocktake that is going to be a formal process, need to be much more cognizant of and internalize much more the consumption metrics as well as the production metrics. So it has to become part of how we talk about this, because we are in a global regime that is really based on this kind of idea of voluntary pledges, disclosure, scrutiny, and ratchet. The consumption story has to be part of that cycle. And at the moment, I think the questioner is right to point out that it is getting short shrift in that conversation. You're muted, Ambassador.
Simone, would you like to add something to that from the European perspective?
Yeah,
Is there need to shift to at least also taking into account that consumption story?
Well, actually, I think this is a fascinating discussion. And as Navroz was speaking, I was thinking about the opportunity of having a reflection that, in my view, is still not there, on what will Europe or the United States do with the revenues of carbon border adjustment measures, because there might be a case in order to ensure the international justice really of this mechanism to, for example, recycle these revenues in certain developing countries in order to stimulate the uptake of green production processes and stimulate innovation. And so this is something that I think could be further researched, because there might be scope also to use this mechanism in order to foster the greening of certain sectors that are exposed to the measure in the developing countries only.
Yeah. Okay. There is one more question, and that is from Ali Nathan. Ali wants to ask, we agree that macro issues and the framework that are discussed at the very top of the pyramid, that is amongst leaders and officials. But, for solving any of these large global issues, it is also very important to have engagement at the very bottom end of the pyramid. That means how do we, encourage the 2.5 million people, for example, of India and China to really take, climate change action or green action at that grassroots level. So the question being asked is, how can macro top-level policies and framework be made accessible and acceptable to the common person? How do we provide that connect between what we are doing at the very top level say, for example, in the multilateral negotiations at the global level. How do we connect that with what is really important, what is really the concerns at the very lower end of the pyramid? Navroz, would you like to first take that up?
Sure. Thank you. That's a great question, because I think ultimately, if you're going to address this problem, it cannot be through technocratic solutions and technocratic interventions alone. So the way I like to think about this, and as Ambassador Saran said, I'm grappling right now with framing the IPCC 6th assessment chapter on national and subnational policies. And one way of thinking about it is that if you like, the bottom of the pyramid, to use the speaker's metaphor, people operate in at least two ways. One is as consumers and another is as citizens, obviously many more ways. But as consumers, there are various choices that one can make about consuming, about buying green products, traveling less, etc., etc. But then as citizens, there is another set of choices that go beyond just the government you elect, but that also signals support for structures that allow people to consume more responsibly. In other words, the consumption side and the citizen side are not distinct. So people are more likely to avoid driving in a car if they have effective transport systems, or if they have cycling paths, right? So you have to mobilize, so people have to mobilize as citizens in order to support a certain consumption lifestyle. So I think we have to think about it in both those ways. But because you can't, the burden of figuring all this out is too high for individuals acting either as consumers or citizens, there have to be ways, and this is where the sort of broader public agenda comes in, there have to be ways of making those pathways more accessible for citizens. Here, again, I'm just going to invoke the UK Climate Change Committee. I think it's an interesting exercise, interesting body, because it has done a great job of making publicly aware in an accessible way the kinds of policy debates that will shape choices and lifestyles of different people. So when we have an NDC conversation in India, this is now being self-critical, it is a purely technocratic conversation. It is done in secret. It sits at the ministry, and that's how most countries do it. It's seen as a diplomatic choice. But actually, the spirit of the Paris Agreement is to make this a public conversation about what sort of society one wants to build. Now, obviously, you don't vote on things like an NDC, but you can have an engaged public conversation, citizens groups, communities, organizing fora, et cetera, with the analysis and the choices out in the public domain. We haven't really started that conversation in India yet about what are the implications of building a lower carbon society. For example, I think that a lot of what we would do for a lower carbon society would also mean a society with cleaner air. There's a lot of support for that, but those bridges have not really been built. But we have to have intelligent public communication to do that, which means asking the right questions in analysis and then prioritizing ways of putting that information out in the public domain that stimulate that conversation, that then allows citizens, community groups, to act in a way that is more engaged, both in their role as consumers and in their roles as citizens.
Okay, thank you. We are running out of time. So is Suman able to come online and ask his question? Suman Berry?
Shyam, I can, but I think I used up enough time earlier, so let me pass at this point. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we have sort of run out of time. There have been a couple of other questions, but one of the questions relating to the embedded carbon and carbon leakage, which Jan von Herf has asked. I think Simone has already covered that in the response that he gave to an earlier question. And there is a comment from Ek Weiss, but he's really talking about, how the kind of challenge that we are facing is really a systemic challenge. It is a result of a systemic crisis that we are facing. It is something inherent in the very structure of the economies that we have actually created over the past 200 years, and we need to get away from that. And I think Ek, you have I think that is certainly something which we need to reflect upon, how to bring about a virtuous cycle in place of what we have, created, which is, in a sense, the really the root cause of the current crisis that we are facing. So I think I would like to end this by thanking both our panelists, both for the excellent presentations that they have made, and also very patiently responding to some of the questions that have been asked, and some of also taking cognizance of some of the work that needs to be done as we go along. Many areas where India and Europe need to work together, but also I would submit that going forward, there are also what I see as perhaps some shoals which we might have to also cross. And I have a suspicion that, as I mentioned, that the coal story and the border adjustment part, unless these are handled very carefully by us, they could in fact become sort of issues in terms of bringing about really an international consensus on dealing with what is really as I mentioned, a defining challenge for the world. With that, let me turn to Andre, my co-chair, who will make the concluding remarks and close the session. Andre, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sham, and thank you above all to the two speakers. I think it was a very, very interesting session that allowed to much better appreciate the different viewpoints. And indeed, as you said, Sham, lots of convergence, but also some important sticking points. No doubt. So I would say first and foremost, I think what we heard showed that indeed this conversation was long overdue. This is, I think, a major issue with major implications over a long period of time. And it's natural that, and I think as the speakers emphasized, that at this very stage in 2020, as we are entering into 2021, Europe and India, although both looking at the same issue, are looking at it through a somewhat different lens. And I think that's perfectly legitimate, it's perfectly understandable. And that may nonetheless be a cause for some friction. Navroz called it sort of elastic concept, and elastic concept when it came to the ambition. And okay, that space needs to be filled. How elastic is elastic? And that only a conversation and a serious discussion can fill that space. I would personally not underestimate the domestic issues also on the European side. I very much appreciate what Simone indicated in his very first slide, with this sort of 90% support for the European Green Deal. And I think that indeed, and especially on the part of younger citizens, there's a very, very strong support. And I agree that the wins of the Green parties, not only in the European election, but also in a number of domestic elections, does indeed show that there is this strong trend. Nonetheless, there are sections, you spoke about coal in India. You don't even have to get to coal and to Germany and to Poland. There are many other sections in Europe, and the Gilets jaunes movement in France was certainly a reminder of that when it comes to measures, implementing measures, not just sort of a principle, a goal which is widely shared, but when it comes to the actual measures, there are also distributional issues and support may be less. So I would not at all underestimate the fact that in Europe there are domestic issues. I think there are domestic issues both in India and in Europe. But again, those domestic issues may be of a different nature given where our societies stand at the moment. And certainly the development issue is there. But there are questions in Europe about, you know, how our growth model, which is a different growth model from India, how does that fit with a greener, more climate-friendly model? And one can have sort of see them as complementary, and I think to a large extent they are, but in certain areas there are conflicts. So in that sense, it's easier to have the conversation, because I don't think that we stand apart into the issues that we are facing, not only internationally, but also domestically. Now, yes, there are a number of, you know, maybe one point that I was called upon to say something is the carbon border adjustment issue. As you know now, the official term in Europe is CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Measure, not tax, but measure. And measure means that still needs to be decided exactly what the measure, how the measure will be implemented. And I think perhaps something useful to say for the Indian audience is that, you know, in the European Commission, which is committed indeed to put forward a proposal, a concrete proposal by June 2021, the main responsibility for this has been given to the taxation side of the Commission. So it's not the trade. It's not viewed as a trade issue. It is viewed as a taxation matter, but the taxation jointly with the people in charge of the climate issue. And there are different viewpoints within the Commission itself. Taxation is something that requires unanimity in Europe. So, you know, that immediately involves a number of sensitivities. There will be implications for trade, and the trade community and DG Trade has their own view on this, and they're quite sensitive to implication that it will have with the foreign partners, and certainly in keeping the WTO rules being respected on this. So there are a number of different sensitivities. I think everybody's on board within, I think, Europe and within the Commission about a carbon border adjustment measure, but exactly the specificities of that measure, how it will translate, I think at the moment there are still, it's still a fairly open question. What I think is not an open question, that indeed there will be a proposal that will be made by June of next year, and that means that indeed there is time to have this discussion with our friends in countries, and in particular in India. So let me close this session. It's already here in Brussels a little over 1 o'clock. You are further on in the afternoon. We shall reconvene in a little bit less than 1 hour for the last session of a 4-session webinar that will be devoted to another issue, which I think has risen to the top of priorities in Europe, and I think also globally, which is the digital agenda. So looking forward to that conversation. Thank you again to all the speakers. Thank you to Sham.
Thank you.
Thank you to all the participants for all the very, very engaging questions.
Thank you.
And talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you very much.